How are you doing with the meeting? How are you doing with the assignment?
Okay, I'll start recording the meeting and then we can get started with things. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the last colloquium for the semester for MD4SG. We're very excited to host Hilary Faxon here, who will talk about small farmers, big tech. And before that, a quick intro to the colloquium series. It's been really nice to have wonderful people talk about different areas related to MD4SG at our colloquium, from topics that really bridge research to practice. And we had this once a month. Please send us your suggestions for future colloquium talks, and we're going to post the recordings on our YouTube channel as well that we're going to send out in an email. And with that, I know it's almost at the end of the semester, so we're very excited to have you all here. I'm going to pass it on to Lily to introduce Dr. Faxon and to get started with our colloquium. So thank you.
So we're extremely lucky to be able to hear from Hilary Faxon today. So Hilary is an assistant professor of environmental social science at the University of Montana and is currently on leave as a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow in the Department of Food and Resource Economics at the University of Copenhagen. Hilary's research, teaching, and public scholarship investigate environment, development, and technology with a focus on social justice in the global South. And Hilary really is such an interdisciplinary expert who brings in all these lenses of ethics, technology, politics, conservation, algorithms, and so on in her work. So I think this really mirrors the interdisciplinary nature of what a lot of folks in the MD4SG community care about as well. So with that, to you, Hilary.
Thanks so much, Lily. Anna, thanks. It's really nice to be here, and I really value spaces like this of exchange and collaboration across disciplines. So I'm excited to share some work. I'm Hilary. I am going to share some of my work about small farmers and big tech in Myanmar, where I've been working for the last decade. I am sort of accidentally focused on technology after doing a PhD focused on land and environment with a social science perspective. And then, as I was saying to Anna, while I was in the field looking at the effects of these land reforms during Myanmar's democratic period, all the farmers got smartphones, and now I study social media and farmers and technology. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to start by setting up the sort of ideas of small farmers and big tech and how I use them in my work. So I did my PhD at Cornell in the College of Agriculture. So I spend a lot of time with people who think about agriculture and development, and in particular, people who think about smallholder farmers who produce about a third of the world's food supply on about a quarter of its agricultural land. And there's been increasing attention to the sort of sustainability benefits of these smallholder farms. They've been shown to have greater species richness and macronutrients in smaller holdings, and also to produce more per acreage. So there are also a lot of people doing this work. So I think it's 84% of farms in the world. I think there are about 570 million farms, and 84% of them are less than 2 hectares or 5 acres. So most of the people who farm in the world, and especially in low-income countries or low and middle-income countries, are farming really, really small plots of land. In the villages where I lived in Myanmar, the average holdings were about 8 acres, so a little higher than that 2-hectare cutoff. But in general, people are farming really small plots, both for food production for their families, but also to sell crops on the market. So my work is really interested. Oh, I was also going to mention a lot of these small farms are in Asia and Africa, but Southeast Asia and East Asia have really small landholding sizes. And a rural sociologist named Jonathan Rigg has asked this question: how do we sort of solve the puzzle of the persistent smallholder farmers? Like a lot of development theories say that farms are supposed to get bigger and bigger and smallholder farmers are supposed to go away. But in Asia, we've actually seen the average land size decrease over time. And the answer that Jonathan Rigg and his colleagues come up with is this idea that small farms provide a sort of social and economic safety net. So even as people go to cities to work or to migrate temporarily, they tend to come back to the farm when times get tough, or when they get laid off from their work, or we saw a lot of return migration in COVID-19. So small farms are a big part of the sort of development puzzle that my work is generally in conversation with, both ecologically, but also economically and socially. So I think in this community, I probably don't have to say much about why big tech is important to think about. I know everyone in this room thinks about it a lot. I just want to highlight that we're in this kind of moment of politically where social media seems to be on the demise on one hand, with over 150,000 people laid off in tech at the end of last year. But at the same time, Americans are spending a ton of time on social media, and there's been massive investment in companies like Alphabet and Meta over the last year. So this importance of social media is especially true, I think, in the global South, where Facebook is still king of social media, even though at least my students in the US really don't use Facebook anymore, think that it's an important player, not only in Myanmar, but in many, many countries. Facebook is the predominant, not only social media platform, but internet platform source for news. So in Southeast Asia, also where I work, there's been a massive increase in internet penetration and social media use. And social media has really been at the heart of a lot of the political movements in Southeast and East Asia over the last few years. So whether that's the Hong Kong protests or the Milk Tea Alliance in Thailand and Myanmar, Southeast Asia for the next, social media for the next generation is really key to some of the movements, pro-democracy and anti-authoritarian movements that we've seen in the last few years. So all this together is just to sort of introduce the context of my work, which examines some of the relationships between small farmers on one hand and big tech on the other. So I'm trained primarily as a qualitative researcher and an ethnographer. So I think about people a lot, and I'm curious about telling a story of social media and digital technology that's not just the story of this guy on the right who gets a lot of play in global media, but also a story of the woman that you can see on the left who is teaching me how to harvest rice by hand in a field in rural Myanmar. And so I'm asking how digital connection reflects and reshape rural life and rural politics, and also making a sort of broad argument in my work that the story of digital technology isn't just the story of Silicon Valley, but also the story of people and places like those that I lived and worked with in Myanmar, who are increasingly thinking about development for themselves and their families with a sickle in one hand and a smartphone in the other. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 papers that have come out of this project, and I will try to speak sort of synthetically and give a broad overview of this work. The first one is ethnographic, and the second one uses some mixed methods, including some very, very light sort of data set computational work. And the papers are published or on their way in journals that tend to be focused in a sort of like critical development studies, One is in agricultural and human values, which speaks to a sort of interdisciplinary agriculture and development audience. And the other is in big data and society, which is sort of critical social science of technology. So they probably feel a little humanistic, but I think together give a picture of how this research has evolved over time. And then I'm just going to take a few minutes at the end to sort of reflect back on what these three projects say and raise maybe some reflections that we can talk about more in the Q&A. I'm really happy to take questions as they come, so don't hold back. Okay, but let's get started with the digital village. So this is a paper that I published last year that brings together two fields that I work in. One is digital geography, so studies of digital connection, how it's reshaping space. And the other is agrarian studies, which is a very old and a little bit crusty field that I was trained in that thinks about agrarian change over time. And the paper is based on 3 years of ethnographic research to think about how these interlinked online and offline practices are both sustaining but also transforming rural life. So the picture that I always use when I talk about this paper is this one, in which some dudes have hooked up a stereo system and a generator to a little truck that's often used to bring rice back from the fields. And they've put a loudspeaker on it, which they've stolen from the pagoda in the village. And they're having a great time sort of like strapping all this technology together with their agricultural inputs so that they can raise the roof for the party. So this sort of like hybrid DIY nature of this technology is really the way that I encountered it in the village. But I'll say a few things about the book project because that's what brought me to this work. So I went to Myanmar in 2013 to work with women's rights activists, but I knew that I wanted to do a PhD and I knew that it wanted to be something about the relationships between gender and inequality and natural resources and democracy. That time was a really exciting time to be in Myanmar because Dawn San Suu Kyi, the Nobel laureate, had just been released from house arrest and elected into the parliament. And people were really excited about the so-called democratic transition that was taking place. So after half a century of civil war and military dictatorship since 1962, Myanmar began a series of reforms in 2011 that would culminate in the election of a civilian government in 2015. So I did most of my PhD research when the National League for Democracy was in power, which ended in February 2021 when the military staged a coup, and Myanmar has now been thrown back into civil war and authoritarianism. So this project, the center of this project is this decade of democratic reform in which land was really central to political transformation. So this idea is not mine, not original. Really early in my PhD, the US ambassador to Myanmar showed up to give a talk at Cornell, and someone asked him about the nation's prospects for post-authoritarian transition, and his answer was, it's all about land. So everyone knew that land was really central to these questions of democratic transition because over 70% of the population is smallholder farmers. The military has long had a history of grabbing land from smallholders and extracting natural resource rents. So figuring out the redistribution of land and of resource rents was really key to the question of whether democracy would last and inequality would be addressed. Okay, the book is speaking to a number of fields that we could just all roughly put in the bucket of sort of critical environment and development, and also to work in Asian studies. So I was trained in Burmese language and Asian studies, and that's been a really important part of how I approach this project within that more grounded tradition. And I've worked all over Myanmar, but the book is set in the Kalay Valley, which is this area you can see in the dark orange box. I chose Kalay because I had really good contacts there for access, but also because there were two different ethnic groups farming an irrigated rice system. And I was curious to think about how land reforms and democratic transition would play out differently for these two different ethnic groups. So this gives a little bit of a sense of what it looks like there. The farmers in Calais farm a single crop of rice, and I spent a lot of time following farmers around, like the guy you can see leading the way here, in order to understand how he was working on his land and what types of challenges he was encountering. In the winter, the farmers drain the rice paddies and plant sunflower seeds, which they sell for and press for oil. So that's the sort of agroecology that we're talking about. Maybe I'll just mention briefly that since the coup, I've started research in this area that's in the yellow box nearby. So it's not been possible to go back inside Myanmar. Unfortunately, I've published too much that's critical to feel confident going back inside the country. But I have a lot of people where I worked have fled across the border to India and to the state of Mizoram. So I've started this winter going back and working on the India side of the border with a lot of the same people that I knew in Calais. And so that's been both, challenging, but also wonderful to find a way to do interviews in this really difficult time. So my work, as I mentioned, is ethnographic, which is sometimes described as deep hanging out. I spent a lot of time hanging out with farmers, former migrants, land activists, members of parliament, people who are either working on changing laws around land and natural resources or experiencing the impacts of that. So these are some pictures of interviews, focus groups in the village pagoda. The picture on the bottom right is actually a timeline of technology in the village. So when different technologies arrived to the village, everything from solar panels and combine harvesters to smartphones, which is one of the exercises we did later in my research as I became interested in questions of technology adoption and how people understood that, what it meant to them. So as I mentioned, I study smartphones by accident. When I first moved to Yangon, I paid $120 for my SIM card, and I had to register it under a Muslim dude's name. And then a year later, SIM cards were $1 and they were sold on the streets. This was the effect of the privatization of telecommunications. So Myanmar's military had long had a monopoly over telecoms. And in 2013, they auctioned the licenses off. The Qatari firm Ooredoo and the Norwegian firm Telenor won the licenses. And within 6 or 9 months, everybody had SIM cards in the village. And no one had much access to internet before. So people who know about Facebook in Myanmar often know about the Rohingya genocide. So Facebook was very aggressive about capturing new users in the country using the Free Basics program, which has been rolled out elsewhere to do so. But just a few years later, it received a lot of international scrutiny for its role in circulating anti-Muslim hate speech and also incitements to violence in what would result in 800,000 people being pushed across the Bangladesh border. So the story of internet in Myanmar is a really dramatic one. But it's often looked at either in terms of these sort of macro level changes or in terms of this very nasty complicity with genocide. And I was really curious, how are the people I live and work with, actually using the internet? What do they make of it? So for the people and the places where I was doing my research, the arrival of the internet did have an immediate impact. Around Calais, the village society was increasingly a digital society. And when I say that, I don't mean that everyone was using the internet all the time, but that this particular type of internet access, which was Facebook access through mobile phones, was becoming inseparable from the daily practices of sharing news, making money, and communicating with families that really make up rural social life. So people where I lived and worked used Facebook to get the local news. Almost everybody followed this page called Colloquium Acontide, which is like everything to know about Colloquium. And they used it to chat, but they also used it in some kind of confusing or surprising ways that I explore in this project. So one is that this sort of arrival of the village Facebook group, which was a Facebook group founded with the name of the village and then the group. It was used for things like buying and selling seeds, announcing funerals or birth, and sometimes even live streaming church services for people who might be working in Bangkok or in Singapore and might not be able to come home for festivals or for religious events. But I'm also kind of thinking about three types of ways that Facebook was used in the village. And the first has to do with securing agricultural livelihoods. So I first got interested in Facebook by talking to this woman called Mahline, who is this young farmer's daughter living in the village and using Facebook to buy and sell seeds for her garden and also to get designs for her tailoring business, which was running out of the family's home. And it was by hanging out with people like this and asking, what do you find useful about Facebook, that I got introduced to the wide world of Myanmar's farmers' Facebook groups, which have played a large part of my life ever since. So this one is called The Challenges and Successes of Rice Farming. It had over 102,000 members when I started following it, and it included posts about how to manage pests, how to buy and sell crops and seeds, and how to use new tractors and combine harvesters, also about crop prices in different parts of the country. So this got me interested in the ways in which Facebook was being used to sort of extend patterns of agrarian livelihoods and trade. So the second major way that I saw folks in the village using the internet was to extend existing patterns of social welfare. So one of my colleagues, Gerard McCarthy, has just written a book, and it's about this really incredible practice of donation and social support across Myanmar. Myanmar is sometimes shows up in news articles as the most generous country in the world because the rates of donation compared to income are so high. And a lot of this takes the form of what's called locally kotu kotha, which translates it as sort of do it yourself. But the argument that Gerard and others have made is that in these places where there's so little state support, usually the state shows up in the form of men in uniform with guns coming to hurt you or burn your house down. People have to band together and find different ways to support each other. So sometimes that can take the form of fundraising to rebuild a bridge after a flood, or making a donation to a common sort of insurance scheme so that if a poor household loses a member of their family, they can afford to pay for the costs of a funeral. But these longstanding practices were starting to show up on Facebook in kind of new ways. So one of them is on the left, you can see a photo, is one of many photos that was posted with this announcement in a village Facebook group that a woman who was working as a maid in Singapore was sending money back to buy cups for the sort of community center so that they could be used for funeral services. And there were a number of photos of her donation and a sort of thank you for donating. And on the right, you can see, and this is in a Chin language, so the script is Roman, a sort of description of a case of a massive eviction in which the government had bulldozed many houses and people had lost their homes and their farms. And this is basically a fundraising campaign for Myanmar diaspora to donate back and help these people who had lost their land. And you can see in the bottom, all these churches and associations in Denmark, the US, and Australia were sending money back to support people who had been the victims of land grabbing. And so the last way that farmers were using Facebook was to mobilize for land justice. So this was the sort of core of my study. And so I was really interested to see the ways in which social media was being wrapped into these new sort of environmental politics. On the left, you can see an example of a sort of coordinated social media campaign. This one is a campaign against a proposed law that would change the definition of customary land and would result in a lot of ethnic minorities losing their access to land. On the right, you can see a cartoon of the former sort of colonial hero of peasant rebellions, Seasan. He's like a big rural hero in Myanmar history. He's come back to life in the present era, and he's looking around and he's complaining that nothing has gotten better or developed in the agricultural sector. And this cartoon, which is really typical for sort of like the genre of Myanmar political critique, was accompanied by a long essay and a long comment stream talking about like, what are the problems with agricultural development and agricultural modernization? Why doesn't the government support small farmers in the ways that it could? And what can be done to change that? So these Facebook groups also really became centers of agrarian politics. So taken together, this first paper talks about the digital village, a networked social space in which online practices emerge from existing agrarian relations to reconfigure the strategies of economic survival, the landscapes of home, and the tactics of politics. And without going too theory wonky, I will say that I'm really thinking against the idea of the digital divide with this paper. So the digital divide, which is so common in the ways that we talk about rural digitization, is a deficit model, and it's one that focuses on issues of access and also assumes certain types of adoption and use, right? It says that adoption and use is supposed to look a certain way, but these people are behind or they're not doing it the same way. And the digital divide can be really useful in policy and advocacy work, and can be really useful in bringing attention to people in places that don't have the same level of opportunity. But what we lose when we use that type of language is an attention to the ways in which basically people's agency, the ways in which people make use of the technology they have, incorporate it into existing practices, and maybe do surprising or interesting things with it. So this idea tries to highlight the agrarian relations that shape the adoption, the use, and even the value of the internet in places like rural Myanmar.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for such a thoughtful overview. It's clear that you've really been immersed and are thinking kind of critically over long time horizons about all the factors that are impacting farmers and just the communities who are on these pages. And I'm very curious with everything that you've discussed about how farmers are like turning to these Facebook groups as a way of like exchanging information and buying seeds and looking for trade opportunities. Like, do you see these Facebook groups as just replacing existing mechanisms or whatever boards of communication methods they used previously, or was it really like an enhancement and expanding the opportunities for trade and knowledge sharing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's more of an enhancement than a replacement, is my first instinct around that. And I think that that's definitely true after the coup because there's been so much loss in connectivity. So redundancy, like that's that common sort of adage in sustainability studies that like redundancy is important or biodiversity is important to sustainability of systems. I think there's a sort of parallel in like social practices, especially in the cases where there's a lot of political volatility. So people might be really keen to start buying and selling seeds on Facebook, but they would still also be saving seeds and trading them with their neighbors and, you know, like calling the guy down the street who their dad knew. And that sort of redundancy makes a lot of sense to me, especially since the coup, we've seen internet costs more, it's more surveilled, and the type of stuff that I was studying in 2017 isn't happening in as robust a way. So, yeah. Yeah, that's great. Should I talk about the mixed method stuff? Should we talk about some big things or take some questions?
Yeah, if anybody else has questions, perhaps now would be a good interlude. Otherwise,
yeah.
I guess another question I have, Hilary, is would you, and I know that you're not setting this up as a comparative study, but do you have just kind of any intuition about how these patterns in Myanmar compare to perhaps like another region of Myanmar or across the border in India or Bangladesh or whatnot?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I think about when I think about comparison is the social media platform. So I haven't designed a study, but I've shared this with people who work in other sorts of global communities with smallholder farmers. And one of the things we always talk about is like, well, if it's not Facebook, what are they using? So does this type of activity look different if it's in private WhatsApp groups, or does it look different if it's like in Telegram or Signal? So I think that one of the big questions to ask is like, so much of this work is bounded by the fact that Facebook was the one and only dominant platform when I did it. And it was all very public. And these platforms that have more private channels, I think or a platform like Twitter that tends to be more text-based, I think would the patterns would be broadly different. So one of the first things that I would ask in a comparative study is like, what is the media landscape, and how do farmers plug into different parts of that?
Fantastic, thank you. Maybe we can continue to your mixed methods section, and then I also just encourage the audience, if anybody has questions, to just please feel free to raise them throughout.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. And thanks for those questions, Lily. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the second part of this work, which has used some different methodologies, basically trying to expand the really tiny ethnographic study and look at social media use across Myanmar in the agricultural sector. So I've done this work. This work was funded by a grant from Facebook Research for independent research. And I did it in collaboration with a Myanmar organization that unfortunately no longer exists, at least not publicly, because it was a target after the military coup, since it's done a lot of work on digital rights. But I can list a couple of my collaborators here, just to say that I've worked with a couple of political scientists, and also a number of Burmese-born researchers as part of this project, including one who's an undergrad at Berkeley, who has helped me out with a little bit of text mining on this project. This is a really text-heavy slide, but just to sort of talk about how this project emerged, the major motivation was to look at the ethnographic work and over a broader scale. So we did this by creating a data set of posts in Facebook groups relating to farming and agriculture in Myanmar. We have about 2,000 posts in this data set, viral posts collected over a 13-week period or a 12-week period, both before and after the military coup. So yeah, we started this project as a pilot for a different study. And then in the middle of it, the military took power, and we continued to collect data to try to understand how these farming Facebook groups changed after a political crisis. I put here on the bottom archive in quotes / data set, because I think the way that we've approached analyzing this data has been in many ways closer to the ways historians approach the archives than a lot of computer scientists might approach a data set. So we've done some really basic descriptive quantitative analysis, and we've done a little bit of text mining, but a lot of what we've done is like think through the content of the posts with the collective wisdom of this team who have a lot of experience thinking about agriculture and development and digital rights in Myanmar. So yeah, these are some examples of the pages and groups we follow. Pages tend to be more top down, things like the government's weather page, which is the top page in our data set. Also commercial pages for selling tractors, or Tueto, which is like a agricultural advice company, but it's owned by Myanmar's largest agrochemical corporation. Groups, on the other hand, are much more grassrootsy. They're just sort of a different type of online collective. So they're often themed around crops. So for example, this one is about, the one on the left is about like rice farming, the one on the top is about orchids, and the one on the bottom is about new agricultural techniques. So my team coded these manually, thematically. So we had a sort of inductively sourced code book with about 40 different codes. This is a sort of selection of the top level codes. We were trying to figure out inductively what type of content is being circulated in these groups. And just to highlight some of the kinds of things we saw a lot of advertisements and promotional material for things like fertilizers and pesticides. We saw a lot of lists and discussions of market prices, like the one in the middle. And then we saw some more creative sort of advertisements, like the one on the top right, which is for a live stream of a traditional dance show that's being put on by one of these agricultural machinery companies. But we also saw stuff that thinks about agricultural markets in really different ways. So a surprisingly popular subset of these posts are these live videos of Facebook of watermelon trading at the Myanmar-China border. Watermelon is one of Myanmar's big agricultural exports. And again, it's often something that agricultural economists understand through quantitative numbers, though the numbers on border trade statistics are pretty terrible or tough to get. in a reliable way. But we found a lot of these live videos of these border trade scenes or people's narration of their own experiences of border trade, and explored some of those using a sort of like narrative approach. Another big sort of theme here was advice about what crops to grow and how to do it. Probably my favorite sort of like guy that appeared repeatedly in our data set was this guy we called the mushroom teacher, because he would post all the time about how to grow and sell mushrooms. You can see his post on the bottom right. And also, again, the sort of like critique, celebration, and debate. So people using Facebook to talk about the conditions of agriculture, to complain about relations of brokerage, and also, yeah, to think about how to improve the situation for small farmers. So this work really extended the ethnographic work, but did it with a different methodology, sort of looking more at a national scale, maybe to Lily's question, about how generic digital technologies are absorbed into some of these circuits of agrarian innovation, or used to sort of provide a commentary on agricultural life. Then this has all been really rosy. So this is usually the point in which critical scholars sort of roll their eyes at me, because things really changed after the military coup in terms of what was happening online, and also, you know, whether the internet was a safe space. So 2 years ago, the military took power again in Burma, and this had a really dramatic impact on my research at large, and also on this particular research project. As I mentioned, it ended up being right in the middle of the data collection phase, and most of my team was in Yangon, in Myanmar at the time. So we had to take a few members of the team off data collection, just because even accessing Facebook was illegal. It was banned a few days after the coup. So just participating in this project, even at the level of monitoring groups or scraping data off of CrowdTangle, would potentially put them at risk if they were stopped and their phones or computers were searched. On the ground, we saw this incredible outpouring of resistance to the military takeover. The streets of Yangon looked like this for a month after the coup. Since then, the Myanmar coup has really left international headlines, but the situation on the ground continues to be really tense. Places like Yangon are controlled by the military and sort of functioning normally, though there's hyperinflation and economic collapse. So it's very hard to make ends meet for many families. But in the countryside, a lot of areas, including the one where I did most of my research, are active war zones now. So very, very different from when I worked there. The military targeted the internet immediately. So they shut down the internet while they took over the parliament. And then they continued intermittent internet shutdowns in the weeks after the coup. And in the longer term, they've actually bought back the companies that they sold private licenses to. So Myanmar is back in the situation of more or less a military monopoly over the internet. We've really seen a reversal of the type of trends that I was talking about earlier. We noticed the impact of these shutdowns immediately in the pages and groups that related to farming that we were following in this project. So just at a very basic level, there was a massive drop off on the number of posts in the farming pages and groups, about 200 of them that we were following as part of this project. But we also saw a qualitative shift in what was happening on the groups themselves. So one of the most dramatic examples are groups like the one on the left. So that's the new banner photo of the group. It's a very sort of clear anti-authoritarian three-finger salute from the Hunger Games, with the red color, which is the National League for Democracy, the one that was sort of thrown in jail during the coup. So it's a really, really strong political statement. The name of the group had used to be the World of Organic Agriculture, but they changed the name of the group to the 2021 Revolution Must Succeed, which was a really popular street protest chant during those days. And they added on the group's About page, this is the translation, this group used to be about agricultural care. Now it has been renamed because nothing is more important than the fate of our country. The group name will be changed back only after a people's elected government is formed. So these are really pretty dramatic examples of politicization of these pretty mundane agricultural Facebook groups. And the post on the right is the day after the coup. It's a member of the Department of Agriculture who posts a sort of like funny poem saying, "I'm an agricultural staff, so I have the habit of using herbicide when I see the green, be warned." And in Myanmar, the green is a really common reference to the military. So this sort of veiled agricultural pun, I guess, talking about the resistance to the coup. So in brief, we did this sort of manual qualitative coding of the posts that we saw and noticed a huge uptick in the percentage of the posts that had political content, with some of the key dates of protests in dark red being especially volatile or political days for posting. And we looked more closely at this, particularly at the shift from a sort of calls for peaceful protests or CDM towards calls for or warnings about violence. So in this sort of timeline, the key date is the end of February, where the Myanmar military started cracking down on peaceful protests. And a lot of peaceful protesters ended up taking up arms against the government. And that was something we tried to track through the coding of our posts. Yeah, we also have looked at this through some text mining, thinking about common words in the data set before and after the coup. So you can see that the group content is still mostly about agriculture, but there are the emergence of these terms like dictator, army, protest, country, citizens, that index a much more political type of content in the groups themselves. And I'll say one thing that's been kind of fun working on this is just thinking about word segmentation in Myanmar. So Myanmar script doesn't have standard word segmentation, and there is a sort of community working to solve some of these problems. And that was a sort of fun exploration of how we might think about text mining with non-Roman scripts. And yeah, so on a more qualitative note, we looked at a lot of images like these, which index sort of rural protest. The one on the left is an old farmer holding a sign that says, we don't want to go back to the era of the rice tax, which is a reference to the socialist authoritarian period when farmers were forced to produce a certain amount of rice for the government. And the other ones I think are pretty self-explanatory, very much agrarian or rural protest. So taken together, this part of the project thinks about the ways in which this anti-authoritarian or pro-democracy mobilization grows out of these specific rural conditions and concerns, and then shows up on the internet. So great, I'm just gonna skip forward to this last slide to talk about sort of what reflecting on this project as a whole might engender for a group like this one. So I think one learning for me has been the possibility of collaboration across disciplines. My own sort of home field, agrarian studies or development studies, tends to be pretty stodgy, I think, about adopting new methods, or I actually find computer science to be a much more innovative and like open field for collaboration. But for me, it's been really useful to think about for example, how to bring some sort of text mining into this project, or what we could do with a site like CrowdTangle, which has all this public social media data, and how we could build on more traditional qualitative methods in the field with different types of methodological collaboration. Another key takeaway, I think, is the importance of these on-the-ground partnerships. So I just mentioned the group that I collaborated with on the mixed methods project, and that was a really difficult partnership because of the political crisis, but nevertheless, one that was really essential, I think, to getting that project off the ground and making sure that it aligned with sort of local interests and needs and some sort of advocacy around digital rights. I think a lot with the term of relations of reciprocity. So it's not always obvious to me how my research can contribute to groups on the ground. And I've seen a lot of change over the last 10 years in Myanmar, but keeping some of those channels open with just signal messaging and relationships over time has not only enabled my research to grow, but also I think made me feel like I have a political and personal connection. And finally, I was thinking a bit about the policy relevance of this research. And one thing I'll say is I started this work spending a lot of time in Myanmar's capital talking to bureaucrats who work on land governance. And now I spend a lot of time talking to Facebook staff in Singapore. So maybe just to say that advocacy is something that happens towards a moving target. So I'm in a situation now where the place where I work doesn't have a government that I want to have any sort of relationship with. And it's really in that space that like advocacy directly to tech companies or and work with digital rights activists starts to become more appealing. So the objects of this sort of advocacy work have really shifted for me over time and made me rethink like what do I talk about when I talk about public engagement, or with whom would I be engaging in this work? Yeah, that's it. That's what I got.
Thank you so much, Hilary. This is really, really, it's so comprehensive, the depth and the breadth in which you have been clearly immersed in this work. And I think that a decades-long relationship, you learning Burmese, spending so much time on the ground is really kind of unprecedented in a lot of the disciplines that we come from, which are typically like computer science, operations research, economics, and whatnot. So we really have so much to learn from you, and I appreciate the 3 reflection chat and in particular. I have a ton of questions, but let me pause to see if anyone in the audience wants to, feel free to just directly unmute.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask briefly, so, you saw all of this information going back and forth about different efficiency and kind of, tips on farming and whatnot. And I know your research wasn't very quantitative, but I'm just curious about like, if we saw any, like differences in like how well these farmers were doing, as the internet activity ramped up, and then of course as it ramped down again in the wake of the coup.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I don't have a solid answer, but I have some speculations. But my first observation maybe is that it's really hard to disaggregate the impacts of the internet from all the other sorts of reforms that were improving life for small farmers. Most notably, like being a small farmer in Myanmar right now really sucks. But it sucks because there's active conflict, there's hyperinflation, there's disruptions to the supply chains of agricultural inputs. And so it would be hard, I think, to figure out what is the role of decreased internet connection in that. And yeah, folks with other methodological backgrounds would be better suited to figure out how to set up that problem. But maybe my observation would be that would be really tough. I think that more anecdotally, some of the positive impacts that I saw on farming of this type of communication were mostly knowledge sharing. So I mentioned the role of agricultural advice, but one really common practice was just to take photos of a plant that wasn't doing well and to ask on a Facebook group, like, what's going on with my bean plants? They're not doing well. And people would reply in the comments with a number of ideas. And this seems really banal, but we have to remember that Myanmar has almost no public agricultural extension services. So farmers don't have access to information about basic cropping practices, except for within their families and their villages. But especially as new crops show up, avocados and watermelon and other things that farmers can grow as cash crops, there isn't a lot of sort of local knowledge about how to grow these crops, and there aren't a lot of other opportunities to get that type of information. So if I were going to try to ask that question in a more quantitative or rigorous way, I think the first things I would look at were sort of what are the impacts of that type of agricultural advice sharing on the practices on the ground.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks so much, Hilary. Again, that was a really wonderful talk. I had a quick question about, like, I thought the data collection and usage, it was really interesting, particularly for these online platforms that a lot of users are using. And I'm wondering, is this kind of data open? How do you think about using this data for thinking about and understanding different socioeconomic factors, perhaps in other fields? I know it'd be really interesting for different sociological studies, network studies. I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I kind of rushed through that because I realized how ugly that slide was. But yeah, CrowdTangle, like using CrowdTangle is really interesting and really frustrating. So this is like a social media monitoring tool owned by Meta that collects public data, public posts on Facebook, Reddit, and Instagram. So we were using Facebook. And so the first thing to note is that it's public data. So while that first ethnographic paper, like I was looking over people's shoulders as they posted things in the Village Facebook group, none of that was accessible because it's all private groups. So that's sort of one layer of like, you're not necessarily seeing these really intimate local relationships, you're seeing through public posts. The other thing, like any of these aggregators or algorithmic, the problem of algorithmic opacity is huge. So like we had so many conversations in the research team about like, when we're being told that these are the most popular posts in the data set, like what does that actually mean? And that's a really, really, really difficult thing to figure out. We actually at one point found this Meta post about like, it's basically, it's like, of course it's semi-arbitrary, or it's like the algorithm is related to the sort of expected popularity of the post. So can we really say it's a viral post, or is it more about, you weren't expecting carrot advice to get such high hits? Figuring out the question of algorithmic opacity in this was really tough for us. And it really restricts our ability to make like quantitative claims about, the most popular posts. Like 60% of the most popular posts were about promoting pesticides. I don't feel confident making that type of claim in the data. We did that analysis, but we just can't really understand why we were getting certain types of data in our data set. And I think the way we address that, which is, I guess, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I was like, we just need more qualitative analysis. Like we need to spend more time manually reviewing what we're getting so that we feel really confident that we know what this data is. But I will say CrowdTangle is both this incredible tool. I've used it in another project that's about buying and selling land on Myanmar Facebook. There's also an insane world of real estate groups in Burmese, which I've become acquainted with. And CrowdTangle's been great for like, it was a similar sort of setup in which we had seen this stuff ethnographically, and we were like, I wonder how common this is. I wonder if this is a national level phenomenon, or we just happen to see this in our sites. So CrowdTangle was great for establishing the fact that like, no, this is a really common practice along the country. Like, it's true that like the price of land has tripled in most of these areas, and that there's this flurry of buying and selling land that's happening on Facebook. But beyond that, to actually try to talk about like, can we say definitively what types of content in what proportions are the most popular, we just quickly run into that wall of algorithmic opacity, which I always just solve through more ethnography. But other people might have other sort of ways around the wall. So yeah.
Yeah, it really seems like all of the content that you covered today, Hilary, touches upon so many research areas that our community cares about. So people on this call and people who might watch the video recording later on YouTube, but everything from market design to algorithmic fairness to content moderation to network analysis to kind of empowering smallholder farmers and data sharing. All of these are kind of technological and mathematical lenses that our community is looking into, and you really provide this kind of on the ground social science, like real world insight into it, which I find so valuable. And maybe a kind of broader question for the kind of work that our group really cares about is, from your experience, what kind of recommendations would you give to researchers who are working with vulnerable populations, either directly chatting with them or working with organizations that work with vulnerable populations, or just have kind of research that impacts those groups? Is there any
I don't know.
advice?
I feel like a really basic thing is it's been so helpful for me to have Burmese people on my research teams, which I would imagine is really common practice. But yeah, especially for the project that's more mixed methods or has that, it's like mostly digital and social media review and analysis. I just don't think that we would really know what we were looking at unless we hung out with a lot of Burmese analysts. And I think maybe another takeaway is that, so the organization that I worked with that was based in Yangon, that was like digital rights focused, they were really, the analysts were great, but they actually didn't know that much about rural areas. Most of them had grown up in the city, and it was like they were really surprised by the type of content we were looking at.
Wow.
So then it became really important that we had this member of the team who I had worked with for 3 or 4 years at that point, and she had done lots of ethnographic work with me in the village. So like just having a Burmese person isn't always enough, but thinking about like for us, it became really obvious that urban Burmese and rural Burmese are like two separate worlds, and to both interpret the data, but also to think about questions of safety or significance, we really needed more people who had had that on the ground experience. So yeah, that's a really basic one.
And what would you say about how to kind of build up those partnerships and bring those people in? And one of the key takeaways you mentioned at the end were, I think, relations of reciprocity. So how can in the rural Burmese person that you brought into your team, like how did you make this like a worthwhile experience for them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, a big part of this, or not a big, but like one part of this is money and thinking about like how money is distributed. And so it was, I mean, it was really dramatic in this case because the organization just kind of disbanded in the middle of my research project, which was very disruptive. But like, you know, thinking about paying everybody during what became like a protracted economic crisis was really important to me and to my sense of like my ethics or my responsibilities as the PI of this project, that even if people couldn't complete the work we had talked about, they were going to get a certain amount of the grant regardless. So that's a super basic question. I think I've also worked with a lot of these people or some of these people to get scholarships, opportunities abroad. So there's just so much hunger for leaving and for education outside of Myanmar. And that has been really rewarding and something that I think all of us as academics have this intimate knowledge of how the academy works that most people don't have any idea of. Though I've also recently heard about using ChatGPT to help people copy edit their essays, which is going to save me hundreds of hours of work. So maybe there is an algorithmic solution to at least part of this mentorship or connection opportunity.
We are reaching the hour, so if there's a final question or reaction that anybody wants to share, please do feel free. Otherwise, we can wrap up.